I used to think Thanksgiving would always feel the same in my family. A noisy house filled with the scent of roasted turkey, a dozen voices talking over each other, and the predictable chaos of people brushing past one another in the crowded kitchen. But this year, as I stood on the front steps of my parents' house with the November chill slipping through my jacket and the wind stinging my ears, I felt an uneasiness that would not let go. My hearing aid hummed softly the faint static that came whenever the battery warmed up, and for a moment I almost turned around. I could have driven back to my small apartment in Columbus and worked overtime at the station, but something in me wanted to try one last time to belong. I had not been home in months, not since the night shift accident, when a distracted driver clipped our ambulance and sent me headfirst into the metal console. 40% hearing loss in my left ear and a dull ringing that never fully went away. The doctors told me I was lucky because it could have been worse. My mother told me I should have chosen a safer career. I pushed the thought away and knocked on the door. The house buzzed the way it always did during the holidays. Pots clattered in the kitchen, the television was on too loud in the living room, and voices blended into a warm mix that might have comforted me once. My mother barely glanced at my hearing aid when she greeted me, only saying, "You are late," before walking away. I stepped inside and felt 20 sets of eyes flick toward me, then drift away again. Family, but not quite mine. I tried to settle myself as I moved toward the dining room table where everyone was gathering. That was when Lucas appeared, my older brother by 3 years and the self-appointed pride of the family. He swept in behind me with the swagger he had perfected since high school, a grin that never reached his eyes, and an energy that always felt like a warning. He looked me up and down as if assessing whether I met the standard of the evening. His gaze caught on my hearing aid, and he smirked. "Well, look at that," he said loud enough for every relative within 10 feet to hear. "Our little robot. Still wearing that thing." I forced a small smile because that was what I had always done. I told myself he was only teasing, but inside, the old tension returned, the kind that settled between my ribs whenever he circled too close. The chatter around us quieted as Lucas leaned in. "Can you even hear us right now, or do we need to speak in beeps?" He made a short clicking sound with his tongue. Some cousins laughed awkwardly before looking away. My mother pretended not to hear. I felt my cheeks warm, but stayed calm. "The device is fine," I said. "I just need a moment to adjust it." The static had grown louder with the heat of the room, and I gently reached behind my ear to steady the connection. The motion seemed to spark something in Lucas. He stepped closer, too close, close enough that I instinctively leaned back. He tilted his head as though inspecting the hearing aid like it was a flawed gadget. "Static girl," he muttered under his breath, but loud enough to be caught by the relatives nearest us. I heard someone sigh. I felt the familiar knot form in my throat. My device sputtered again, and a sharp feedback tone pierced my ear. Subtle, but enough to make me wince. I tried to cut my hand around it to mute the noise, but Lucas let out an exaggerated laugh. "Everyone hear that our girl is picking up radio signals now. Maybe she is talking to aliens." A few uneasy chuckles floated around the room. I felt myself shrinking. The ringing in my ear grew harsher, and the room seemed to tilt ever so slightly. I reached for the volume control, but before I could touch it, Lucas moved. It happened so fast I barely registered it. 1 second his hand was at his side, and the next it was at my ear. His fingers brushed my hair as he grabbed the hearing aid, not roughly enough to injure me, but firmly enough that the gesture felt sharp and humiliating. I gasped and stepped back. Lucas held the device between his fingers for a single suspended moment. Then he let it drop to the hardwood floor. The sound of the plastic casing hitting the ground seemed louder than any voice in the room. It bounced once, then split into 2 pieces. My stomach dropped with it. The ringing in my ear pulsed, and the room blurred slightly as I blinked. Nobody moved. The silence that followed felt heavier than the noise that came before it. I knelt slowly and picked up the broken pieces, my hand trembling, though whether from the shock or the quiet devastation, I was not sure. I lifted my gaze toward my parents. I expected anger, or at least an instinct to protect. Instead, my mother gave a soft, uneasy laugh. "Lucas did not mean it, honey. It was just a joke." "A joke." My father nodded as if that settled everything. "Do not make a scene. It is Thanksgiving." I felt my breath catch. A joke. the words repeated in my mind as though they were knocking from the inside. I stood up without speaking. My hearing was lopsided now. One ear alive with voices in the house, the other filled with a soft, muffled hum that made the world feel distant. I turned toward the front door. No one stopped me. I stepped outside into the cold. The temperature was barely 31 degrees and the air hit my face like a wake-up call. I walked to my car with the fragments of my hearing aid in my palm and felt something inside me shift and crack in a way that was not loud but permanent. They did not break my ear, I thought. They broke something else. Something they may never get back. I used to believe that families were simply messy, that arguments and favoritism and the occasional sharp comment were just part of growing up. But the older I became, the more I realized that what I lived through was not messiness, but a pattern, a slow and steady shaping of who mattered and who did not. Sitting in my car that night with the broken hearing aid still in my pocket, I found myself thinking back to the earliest moments, when the imbalance began moments so small that no one noticed except me. When we were children, Lucas could do no wrong. If he threw a tantrum at the grocery store, my mother would soothe him with a smile and say he was spirited. If he shoved me during a game in the backyard and I fell hard enough to scrape my palms, my father would shrug and say, "Boys will be boys," while handing me a paper towel. I learned early that kindness was expected from me and indulgence was reserved for him. The praise flowed toward Lucas like heat rising, unstoppable and constant. He was smart because he raised his hand in class, brave because he jumped off the shed roof into a pile of leaves destined for greatness because he declared it so at age 9. Meanwhile, I folded laundry by the time I was 10, washed dishes after dinner, and kept quiet during adult conversations. When I won the statewide science fair in 8th grade, my teacher made a huge announcement, but at home, my mother said that trophies were just things that collected dust and that I should help set the table. But when Lucas made the junior varsity basketball team, she called every relative within an hour. I did not resent him for existing. I resented the way the house turned toward him like a compass finding its north, while I learned to live as a shadow on the wall. My choice to become an EMT at 19 was the first independent decision I ever made. I wanted a job that mattered, one where quick hands and a calm voice could be the difference between someone seeing tomorrow or not. It was the first time in my life I felt a sense of purpose that belonged solely to me. My parents did not understand. They said it was reckless, unstable, not a real career. I tried to explain the feeling of pulling someone from a wreck, or helping a child breathe easier, or keeping pressure on a wound during a long transport. They nodded politely, then told their friends that I was going through a phase and would switch to something safer eventually. Lucas, on the other hand, had a rotating cycle of short-lived sales jobs, none lasting more than a year. But every time he started a new one, my parents bought him a new suit or congratulated him with a family dinner. Hard work from me was expected and overlooked. Minimal effort from him was celebrated. It was a system they taught without speaking. When the accident happened last spring, the one that took a chunk of my hearing and left a scar behind my ear, my mother's reaction cut deeper than the injury. "If you had chosen a real career, this would not have happened," she said, as though the driver who ran the red light had consulted my resume first. I did not argue. I never argued. Instead, I attended every follow-up appointment, got fitted for the hearing aid, and learned how to navigate a world where sound was uneven, where sirens were sharp on one side and dull on the other. My colleagues at the station were patient, helping me adapt to new routines and making jokes that actually felt like jokes because they were wrapped in care rather than cruelty. But at home, everything was different. Lucas looked at the hearing aid like it was an inconvenience he had to tolerate. My father suggested I keep it on the lowest setting at family gatherings because he did not want anyone asking questions. And when I stayed away from home for months, choosing to work holiday shifts rather than sit through the same tired dynamics, my parents told relatives that I was busy saving lives, but their tone implied I was being dramatic. When the Thanksgiving invitation came this year, something inside me stirred. I wondered if they missed me. I wondered if they had softened. I wondered if Lucas had grown up even a little. I wanted to believe a family could change. So I convinced myself that maybe I should at least try. Maybe holidays were a chance to start again. But as I replayed the moment he smashed my hearing aid on the hardwood floor, I saw the truth more clearly than I ever had. That act was not a sudden outburst. It was the natural next step in a lifetime of unchecked temper and whispered excuses. It was an extension of every moment he pushed past my boundaries because he knew no one would stop him. And the worst part was not the sound of plastic cracking or the ringing in my ear, but the silence that followed the way a room full of people who claimed to love me chose convenience over compassion. They told me not to make a scene, but the real scene had played out for years in small patterns repeating until they became a family tradition. I had returned hoping for warmth, but all I found was the same script we had followed since childhood. The problem wasn't that Lucas acted like this. The problem was that they all expected me to absorb it. As I sat in my car, watching my parents' porch light glow against the dark Ohio night, I understood something with a clarity that felt almost calm. The roots of the night's humiliation were planted long before adulthood, and I was done watering them. When I walked back into the house a little while later, the warmth inside felt almost artificial, like someone had turned up the thermostat to hide a deeper chill. I had needed a moment outside to breathe and to steady the uneven hum in my ear. But part of me also hoped someone would follow me, maybe my mother or father, maybe even a cousin who had seen everything. No one did. The laughter that drifted from the dining room sounded forced, as if everyone had agreed to pretend the earlier moment had not happened. I slipped back into my seat at the far end of the long table, hoping the familiarity of the holiday spread might ground me, but I felt more like a visitor than a daughter. The turkey platter sat in the center, surrounded by bowls of mashed potatoes and stuffing, but even the food looked distant to me. My father cleared his throat lightly, as though he were trying to reset the mood. "Let us try to enjoy dinner," he said with that formal tone he used whenever he wanted to smooth over something uncomfortable. Lucas, who was leaning back in his chair with a smug confidence he had worn since childhood, took the cue immediately. He flashed my parents one of his practiced grins and then turned his attention to his phone, tapping it lightly on the table as he read something he clearly wanted the whole room to hear about. "Big news at work," he announced before lifting his chin like he was preparing to accept applause. "They put me in the team lead probation program. I am finally moving up." My mother beamed and clasped her hands together as if he had been named company vice president, rather than placed on probation for behavior they knew nothing about. "That is wonderful, Lucas. See what happens when you apply yourself." The relatives seated closest to him murmured congratulations. I knew enough about the industry to understand that probation programs were usually corrective, not celebratory, but no one at that table wanted to hear that truth. I pushed a small piece of turkey around my plate, trying to avoid eye contact, but my mother always had a way of redirecting the spotlight toward the quietest person. She turned to me with a sympathetic smile that did not reach her eyes. "Emily, you are just tired from all that EMT stress. That accident took a toll. You know how sensitive you have been lately." Sensitive. The word landed like a weight on my chest. It was the same label they had given me when I cried at 7 years old after Lucas broke my favorite toy, the same label I heard when I confronted him at 15 for making fun of my clothes, the same label they used when they wanted to brush aside something hurtful. I opened my mouth to respond, but my father cut me off gently before I even spoke. "Let it go, sweetheart. Your brother was only joking earlier. No harm done." The broken hearing aid pieces were still in my coat pocket. The memory of the sound it made on the floor still vivid, but to them it was reduced to nothing more than silliness. A few cousins nodded in agreement, and the small murmurs around the table felt like a quiet chorus of dismissal. Lucas smirked again, stretching his arms casually like someone who had been absolved of a crime he never intended to acknowledge. "See, Dad gets it," he said. "You really need to lighten up, Emily. Everyone has been on edge since your accident." The implication hung in the air like fog. To them, I was the one creating tension, not the brother who had crossed a boundary so blatant that even the room had gone silent. I felt heat rise beneath my skin. I pressed my fingertips against the tablecloth and focused on the fabric just to stay centered. Across the table, my aunt shifted uncomfortably as if she wanted to say something but stopped herself when she saw my mother's watchful gaze. It was as if the room had silently voted that harmony mattered more than honesty. My mother leaned closer, lowering her voice in a tone people use when they think they are being compassionate. "Honey, Your hearing aid was probably on its last leg anyway. Those devices are delicate. You should not take it personally. A wave of disbelief rolled through me. Not personal. She had watched Lucas snatch it from me and drop it. There was nothing delicate about the gesture, but in that moment, everyone played along, treating the event like a misunderstanding rather than a hurtful act. I looked at my father hoping for some kind of recognition, even a flicker of apology, but he only sighed and patted my hand as if I were a restless child. It is Thanksgiving, Emily. No need to dwell on small things. A distant hum echoed in my left ear where the device had once helped balance the world. Without it, the room felt lopsided, voices uneven, like I was watching my own family through a warped lens. I swallowed hard and tried to breathe through the tightness in my throat. I wanted to scream that it was not a small thing, that nothing about it felt like a joke. But when I looked around the table and saw the familiar expressions urging me to keep the peace, the words stayed trapped inside. Lucas chuckled and lifted his glass. No hard feelings, sis. I am sure you can get that little gadget replaced. Maybe it will even be an upgrade. The table erupted in soft, polite laughter, and in that moment I felt the kind of isolation that does not come from being alone, but from being surrounded by people who refuse to see you. Something inside me cooled. Not anger, not yet, but a clarity that settled deep in my chest. These were people I had spent my life trying to please, people I had defended in front of friends, people I had hoped would one day treat me with the same care I offered them. Instead, they sat here asking me to swallow my hurt, so Lucas could enjoy his meal uninterrupted. I placed my napkin on the table with quiet precision. For a brief second, my mother glanced at me, maybe sensing the shift, but she looked away quickly, unwilling to confront what it meant. I stood and walked out again, not because I wanted to flee, but because staying meant continuing a story I no longer wanted to participate in. The cold air hit me a second time, and this time it did not sting. It steadied me. It cleared the noise. It reminded me that sometimes stepping away is the only way to hear your own truth. When I stepped outside for the second time that night, the cold November air no longer felt like a shock to my system, but like something steady and honest holding me upright after the weight of the dining room finally pushed me past my limit. The sky stretched wide and gray over the quiet suburban street, and the porch light from my parents' house cast a soft glow across the driveway, a glow that used to mean safety when I was younger, but now only reminded me how far I felt from belonging. I walked slowly toward my car, each step making the muffled ringing in my left ear pulse in uneven waves. Without the hearing aid, the world sounded distant on one side and painfully sharp on the other, as if the night itself had been sliced down the middle. When I reached the driver's door, I paused with my keys in hand and let myself breathe. My fingers were trembling slightly, not from the cold, but from that strange mixture of disbelief and clarity that follows a moment you know you cannot return from. I slid into the driver's seat and closed the door, and for a moment the silence inside the car wrapped around me like a thin blanket. My breath fogged the windshield, and the faint hum of the engine as I turned the key felt like a small mercy. I sat there gripping the steering wheel while memories flickered through my mind, not only from tonight, but from the accident months earlier, the one that changed the way I heard the world. I had never rewatched the footage from my partner's body camera, except once right after the crash when everything felt blurry and unreal. But tonight, something in me needed to see it again, not to relive the trauma, but to remind myself of the strength I had forgotten. I reached for my phone, opened the secure folder where the file lived, and pressed play. The screen lit up my car with a bluish glow, and the footage unfolded just as I remembered. The ambulance sirens cut through the dark while we sped toward the intersection, a routine call until the other driver ran the light. The impact came fast, a jolt that threw everything sideways. The body cam view jarred violently, then steadied as my partner crawled toward me. I watched my own body lean against the console, stunned but conscious, and I listened as he called my name again and again until I responded. I saw him guiding me out of the vehicle, keeping my head supported, telling me I was going to be okay. But what struck me most was the moment when I tried to speak, and the sound came out uneven, like the world had shifted off balance. That was the night I lost part of my hearing. But it was also the night I realized how much strength lived inside me, the kind that showed up quietly and without asking for praise. I paused the video and looked at my reflection faintly mirrored in the screen. Why can I be brave with strangers but small in front of my family? The question had lived in me for years, but tonight it rang with a clarity that cut through the fog of every excuse I had ever made for them. I deserved better than being the target of jokes disguised as love. I deserved better than having my pain minimized to protect someone else's ego. I deserved better than a family that handed out compassion like it was a limited resource they had to save for the child who yelled the loudest. I pressed my forehead lightly against the steering wheel and let the truth settle. The quiet around me no longer felt empty, it felt purposeful. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the broken hearing aid. The tiny pieces lay in my palm, cold and fragile. A reminder that something tangible had been destroyed, but something far more important had been revealed. They broke my hearing aid, I whispered to myself, but they will not break me. I turned the ignition fully and eased the car out of the driveway. The street was almost silent except for the soft crunch of my tires on the frosty pavement. Houses glowed with warm lights inside families gathered around tables, laughter drifting out of windows that I passed like scenes from another world. I drove without rushing, letting the road unwind before me. The miles between my parents' house and my apartment usually felt long, but tonight they felt like a bridge I was finally crossing. Somewhere along the highway, my phone buzzed with a notification, but I ignored it. Whatever it was could wait. What mattered now was that for the first time in years, I was choosing myself without waiting for permission. As I exited onto the familiar road leading home, the ringing in my ear softened to a dull echo, almost like my body acknowledging the shift happening inside me. I parked in my usual spot outside my building, turned off the engine, and sat there listening to the quiet, the real kind. Not the heavy silence that filled my parents' dining room, but the steady grounding stillness of someone reclaiming their life. I stepped out of the car, feeling the cold air again, but this time it felt like a beginning rather than an ending. When I reached my apartment door, I paused and looked back at the parking lot lights casting long shadows across the pavement. It struck me that sometimes walking away makes more noise than staying ever could. Tonight, I exited quietly, but the truth of that exit would echo far louder than any confrontation. I unlocked the door, walked inside, and closed it behind me with a soft click that felt like a promise to myself. Back inside my apartment, the quiet felt different from the quiet in my parents' house. This quiet had weight, but not suffocation, a kind of stillness that let me breathe for the first time since the moment Lucas reached for my hearing aid. I hung my coat on the hook by the door and placed the broken device gently on the kitchen counter, its two small pieces resting like evidence from a moment I could no longer pretend was accidental. My left ear buzzed faintly the uneven hum that always returned when I took the device off, but I let it be. I was too drained to care about the lopsided silence. I made myself a cup of tea, though I knew I would forget to drink it, and sat at the small kitchen table with my laptop. The screen lit up and I stared at the blank email window for a long time before actually moving my hands. Documentation. That word had been drilled into me from day one of EMT training. If you did not document it, it did not happen. We recorded every detail on shift, even the small things. Timestamps behaviors, injuries, responses, equipment issues. Facts, not emotions. In the field, accuracy could protect both the patient and the provider. Now in this moment, I realized accuracy could protect me. I opened a new document and typed out the timeline from the beginning of the evening. Arrival time. First interaction. The moment the feedback tone spiked. The moment the device hit the hardwood floor. I described what I heard, what I saw, and what physically happened to the hearing aid without embellishing a single detail. I kept my words neutral and factual exactly as they taught us. No dramatizing, no assumptions about intention, only what was documented through direct observation. When I finished, I attached 2 photos I had taken of the broken pieces under the light. I then added a screenshot of the diagnostic readout from the manufacturer app. It showed the last active signal recorded before the device disconnected entirely. None of these things told a full emotional story, but they told the truth in the way systems understand truth. My hands shook a little, not from fear, but from a strange mixture of exhaustion and determination. I opened another folder on my laptop, one I had created months earlier after Lucas had sent a string of late-night messages making fun of my hearing changes. At the time, I saved them only because something felt off, not because I expected I would ever need to show them to anyone. The messages were cruel but casual, mocking the way I tilted my head during conversations and accusing me of pretending not to hear him when he joked. I dragged them into a single PDF file. Then I remembered the Ring camera installed beside my parents' front door. My father had added it 2 years earlier for simple security reasons, and I wondered whether it had captured anything from the commotion. I texted my Aunt Ruth, the one person in the family who had always seen things more clearly than the others. I asked if she could access the footage or if my parents would have to do it. She responded within minutes. "Honey, I already saved the clip she wrote. I saw it happen. I am so sorry." She sent the file without hesitation. When I opened it, my breath caught. The angle was limited, but it clearly showed Lucas stepping toward me, and then, the moment my hands lifted in surprise. The sound was muffled because it was outside, but it was enough to prove that the gesture was not playful or light. I felt a heaviness settle in my chest. Seeing it from the outside made the moment feel even more surreal. There it was. Not my memory, not my interpretation. Just a fact. I added the video to the evidence folder on my laptop. Then, I opened my insurance provider's portal and began a claim for a replacement hearing aid. The form asked for the usual details: the device model, the condition of the broken unit, and whether it had been lost, damaged accidentally, or damaged through an incident involving another person. When I selected the last option, a message popped up explaining that claims involving deliberate or external damage sometimes required a police report or incident verification for processing. It was not threatening, it was protocol. I took a slow breath and continued. My profession required accuracy, not emotion, so I wrote exactly what happened, the time, the location, the action, and the outcome. When the form asked whether I felt unsafe, I paused. The truth was complicated. I had felt vulnerable, exposed, humiliated, and ignored, but the form did not ask for emotional nuance. It only asked whether I expected further harm. I selected no. When I submitted the claim, the system sent an automated email confirming that an adjuster might contact me within 48 hours to verify the details. I closed the laptop, leaned back in the chair, and let my eyes fall shut. The house was quiet, except for the faint hum of my refrigerator and the soft ringing in my ear. I realized then that this was the first moment all night that I felt in control. Documentation had always been my way of making sense of chaos. It turned confusion into clarity and fear into steps. It could not undo the past, but it could create a record that stood on its own, unaltered by gaslighting or family narratives. I opened my eyes again and looked at the broken hearing aid on the counter. It was strange how something so small could change the way you saw an entire family. It was not just the device that had cracked. It was the illusion that if I loved them enough or forgave them enough or stayed quiet enough, things would get better. Now everything was clear. The truth was visible and recorded, and for the first time in a long time I felt like I had proof not only of what happened, but of what I was worth. The morning light crept through my blinds long before I was ready to face it, painting a faint stripe across my living room floor as I sat curled on the couch with a blanket around my shoulders. I must have dozed off at some point, though it felt more like drifting in and out of an uneasy half-sleep where the events of the night replayed again and again in fragments. The moment Lucas reached for my hearing aid, the sound it made on the floor, my mother's uncomfortable laugh, my father telling me not to make a scene. Even in the quiet of my apartment, the memory hummed in my mind as steady as the ringing in my ear. I was pouring myself a weak cup of coffee when my phone buzzed. The caller ID read Columbus Police Department, a number I recognized from work but never expected to see on my personal phone. My stomach tightened. I answered with a polite greeting, instinctively falling into my professional demeanor. The officer on the line introduced himself, his tone calm and respectful. He explained that my insurance claim had flagged an incident involving damage to medical equipment and that they were simply verifying details. He made it clear that no one was pressing charges and no one needed to. He said it was routine and that my cooperation would help them file the report properly if the insurance required additional confirmation. I told him the truth the same way I had typed it the night before. I did not add emotion. I did not dramatize. I spoke plainly as though I were recording an EMT incident report. When he asked whether I wanted to file a formal complaint against Lucas, I said no. My voice did not shake. The officer paused and said he respected that decision, but wanted me to know I had the option if anything changed. After we hung up, I sat still for a long moment staring at my phone on the counter. The call had been simple, straightforward, but I knew its ripples would not be. Not in my family. They would not see it as a routine verification. They would see it as betrayal. The next call came less than 10 minutes later. My mother's name filled the screen. I let it ring twice before answering, though I already knew the tone she would use. "Emily," she started before I could say hello. "An officer called your father this morning. He said he needed to confirm something about last night." Her voice was sharp with accusation, thinly wrapped in concern. "Why would you involve the police over a joke?" I closed my eyes and leaned against the counter. "I did not involve them," I said quietly. "The insurance company requires verification when a medical device is broken by someone else. It is their policy, not mine." My mother let out an impatient breath. "Lucas told us you exaggerated what happened. He said it was an accident and you misunderstood. He would never hurt you. You know how playful he is." Playful. The word felt so foreign I almost laughed. Instead, I held on to my calm. "I am not exaggerating, and it was not playful." There was a long pause on the other end, followed by my father's voice joining the call. "Emily, you need to stop making this bigger than it is. Your brother is under enough pressure at work. This is not the time for drama." I pressed the bridge of my nose, feeling the familiar heaviness of conversations where facts did not matter unless they protected the right person. "I told you exactly what happened. If you choose not to believe it, that is your decision. But I did not ask anyone to call you. That was the truth. That was all I offered." My father sighed as though I were the one ruining his morning. Then my mother added something that made my chest tighten for an entirely different reason. "You know, honey, you have been so emotional since the accident. Maybe you misheard what happened. Maybe your hearing aid malfunctioned." The quiet disbelief inside me deepened. Misheard. Malfunctioned. The mental gymnastics they performed to avoid holding Lucas accountable were endless. I ended the call gently, telling them I needed to get ready for my shift, though I was not working until late afternoon. As soon as the phone hit the counter, it lit up again. This time, it was Lucas. I let the call go to voicemail. It buzzed again. Then again. Then came a stream of text messages, each more insistent than the last. One read, "You better fix this." Another said, "Tell them you lied." "They are talking about suspending me." My hands tightened around the edge of the counter. He thought I lied, or maybe he did not think that at all. Maybe he just wanted me to rewrite the truth to save him from a consequence he earned. The messages kept coming until I silenced the notifications. A moment later, a different vibration filled the quiet, a text from Aunt Ruth. "Honey, I know they are trying to turn this on you. I just want you to know I saw everything. You did not imagine it." I stared at her message for a long moment, letting the validation steady me in a way nothing else had. It was strange how a few honest words could hold more weight than an entire family's denial. The rest of the morning passed in waves of calls and notifications. My father left a voicemail telling me I owed Lucas an apology for making things complicated. My mother texted asking how I could embarrass the family like this. A cousin sent a neutral-sounding message asking if I was okay, but quickly followed it with, "You know how Lucas is. He gets carried away. He did not mean it." The chorus was familiar, the words recycled, but something in me had shifted too deeply to be moved by them now. I poured out the cold coffee, made a fresh cup, and sat by the window. The sun was rising high enough to brighten the edges of the buildings across the street. I took a slow sip and let the warmth settle in my chest. I had spent years shrinking myself to fit into a family that had no interest in making room for me. But today, for the first time, I felt myself expanding into the truth rather than folding into their narrative. The calls would keep coming. The pressure would increase. But the truth was no longer negotiable. What happened, happened. And I was done letting them rewrite me. By early afternoon, the pressure in my apartment felt like weather changing, a slow buildup of tension in the air before a storm breaks. The calls from my parents had stopped for the moment, but silence from them was rarely a sign of calm. It usually meant they were regrouping, rewriting a story to make it easier to digest, deciding which version would allow them to avoid responsibility. I sat on my couch with my knees pulled to my chest, staring at the muted television while my mind tried to settle. I knew the police verification had gone through. The officer had been polite and professional, and the conversation had been routine, but I also knew this meant he likely contacted Lucas as well. Policies vary, but the company Lucas worked for, a home security sales firm, was known for promoting an image of reliability. Any incident involving an employee, even one that did not result in charges, triggered a mandatory internal review. I had seen cases like that through EMT calls over the years. Companies did not take chances with public reputation. Around 2 o'clock, my phone buzzed again. This time, it was not a call. It was a screenshot from my cousin Leah. I almost ignored it until I saw the message she wrote under it. "You did not hear this from me." The screenshot showed a short text from someone in Lucas's department. It had been forwarded through a chain until it reached her. The message said management needed to meet with him immediately due to a police-related inquiry, and that per company policy he was placed on temporary suspension pending clarification. My chest tightened, not from guilt, but from the weight of inevitability. I had known this would happen as soon as the officer called. Still, seeing it in writing made everything real in a new way. Before I could even process the screenshot, my phone lit up again with an incoming call from my father. I answered because some part of me still held a fragile hope that maybe just once he would choose fairness over image. He did not. His voice came through sharp, more frustrated than angry, the tone he used whenever something disrupted his idea of a perfect family. "Emily, do you have any idea what you have done to your brother? His job is on the line." They suspended him. Suspended. Not fired, not arrested, not publicly shamed, just suspended pending review. A completely standard response to an incident that required verification. "Dad," I said quietly. I did not do anything to him. His actions led to this. "I just told the truth." My father groaned as though the truth were inconvenient rather than foundational. "Your brother is devastated. He says you made things sound worse than they were. He says he barely touched you." My hand tightened around the edge of the couch cushion. I tried to keep my voice even. I gave a factual account. Nothing more, nothing less. My father lowered his tone, but not his blame. "Families do not do this to each other. They protect each other. You should have come to us instead of letting outsiders get involved." I nearly laughed at the irony. I did come to them. They dismissed it. And all of this started because of Lucas, not me. But there was no point arguing. My father had already decided the version of events that made him most comfortable. I hung up before the conversation spiraled into another cycle of denial. My phone buzzed again, almost immediately, a text from my mother. "How could you let this go so far? It was just a toy. You ruined Thanksgiving and now you ruined your brother's career." My hands tightened as I read it. A toy. The hearing aid that helped me function at work and in daily life reduced to a toy. My chest ached, not from sadness, but from the clarity that had been building since the night before. They were protecting Lucas not because he was right, but because it was easier than asking him to change. I set my phone face down on the couch and took a deep breath. The ringing in my ear pulsed faintly, a reminder of everything I had lost and everything I was no longer willing to lose. I stood up and walked to the kitchen sink, letting cold water run over my hands until the tension eased. Then I heard another buzz from the living room, a text from Aunt Ruth. "Honey, I just heard from your mother. They are in a panic because the police officer called Lucas. You did nothing wrong. Do not let them convince you otherwise." I closed my eyes, grateful for her presence, even from afar. I typed back, "Thank you." I needed to hear that. A moment later, she responded, They are angry because the truth has consequences, not because you lied. That sentence landed with a steadiness I had not felt in years. I made myself a small lunch, though I barely tasted it. Then I opened my laptop to check the insurance portal again. The claim now showed a note stating that verification had been completed and additional review was underway. It was a small update, but it meant my documentation had mattered. It meant the truth had been seen by a system that did not rely on family loyalty or emotional manipulation. I took a slow breath and looked around my apartment. The place was small with thrift store furniture and mismatched cups, but it was mine. Every inch of it. And it felt more like home than my parents' house had in years. My phone buzzed again this time with a message from an unknown number. I hesitated before opening it. It was from someone on Lucas's sales team, someone I barely knew from a 4th of July cookout years ago. The message was short. "Hey, just wanted to check if you are okay. I heard something happened. None of my business, but I saw how he talks sometimes. Hope you are taking care of yourself." My throat tightened at that. Even people who barely knew me saw more truth than my own family. The rest of the afternoon passed in small waves. I washed dishes. I folded my uniform for the next shift. I reorganized the drawer where I kept batteries for the hearing aid. Each task grounded me a little more. By evening, I felt something shifting inwardly, a solidness forming beneath the pain. These were not vengeful consequences. They were natural ones, the kind that arise when truth meets behavior. Lucas was not in trouble because of me. He was in trouble because he hurt someone and assumed he never had to answer for it. And my parents were not upset because I lied. They were upset because I stopped protecting the version of him they wanted to believe in. When night finally settled over Columbus and the street outside my window grew quiet, I realized something essential. I had not ruined anyone's life. I had simply stepped out of the role that made it easy for them to ignore their own choices. And natural consequences have a way of finding people when the person who always absorbed the impact finally steps aside. By the next morning, the air around my family felt different even from a distance. It was as if the carefully polished version of our household, the one my parents had spent decades maintaining, had begun to crack under its own weight. The calls and messages came in waves, each one more frantic than the last, as though panic had replaced certainty and they no longer knew which story to cling to. I woke to 5 missed calls from my mother, 3 from my father, and 1 from a number I did not recognize but immediately assumed was Lucas. I let the phone buzz itself quiet on the nightstand while I sat on the edge of my bed rubbing my temples as the faint ringing in my left ear pulsed like an echo from the night everything changed. When I finally checked the first voicemail, my mother's voice rushed through the speaker. "Emily, this is getting out of hand. Your father spoke with Lucas and he is very upset. He said the officer exaggerated what happened. He said you two were playing around and he barely touched you. He insists it was an accident." The pause in her voice felt like hesitation, but not the kind rooted in doubt. It was the kind that came from realizing the story she had been defending was no longer holding together. I deleted the voicemail before she finished. The next message was from my father. His tone was stern, the familiar mix of disappointment and authority that had shaped my childhood. "Emily, listen, we talked to Lucas and he explained everything. He said he jokingly reached for the device it slipped and you misunderstood. You know how easily confused things can get with that ear of yours." I closed my eyes, pressing the phone to my knee as the words settled heavy in my chest. That ear of yours. As though my hearing loss made me unreliable, as though the injury I fought to recover from somehow undermined my credibility in their eyes. I deleted the message and opened the next one, expecting more of the same. Instead, it was my Aunt Ruth. "Sweetheart, I know they are trying to repaint what happened. Do not let them. The truth is, the truth no matter how they twist it." My throat tightened with gratitude. I played her message twice before saving it. 20 minutes later, my mother called again, and before I could silence the phone, I accidentally answered. Her voice burst through immediately. "Emily, you need to help us understand what is going on." The officer questioned Lucas, "and now your brother is saying you made it sound like he attacked you." I took a breath, steadying my tone. "I made it sound factual. That is all." She huffed as if the word factual offended her. Your cousin Mark said he looked at the video and it is not as dramatic as you made it sound. My heart thudded as a ripple of understanding moved through me. Someone had gotten access to the ring footage and was now selectively interpreting it for my parents. Let me guess, I said quietly. Mark said my reaction was the problem, not what Lucas did. My mother hesitated. Well, he said it looked like an accident, that maybe you were startled and overreacted. I felt something in me shift, not anger, not sadness, but a cold clarity that pulled everything sharp into focus. Mom, you saw my face last night. You saw the hearing aid in pieces. You heard what Lucas said afterward. Nothing about it was an accident. She exhaled as though I were being unreasonable. Families make mistakes, Emily, but you are making this into something bigger. You know how dramatic things can look on camera. I almost laughed into the phone. Gaslighting by claiming the video was misleading. Classic. I kept my voice calm. The video shows exactly what happened. Nothing more. Nothing less. She did not respond immediately. Instead, she lowered her voice as if trying to coax me into a softer version of the truth. Honey, your brother said he did not mean anything by it. You are taking it out of context. There was no context to be taken. He reached for something that was not his and broke it. And my parents pretended it was fine. The next message arrived moments after I hung up. A text from Lucas. Just fix this. Tell them you overreacted. My job is on the line because of you. I stared at the message for a long time. Not once did he express remorse. Not once did he acknowledge what actually happened. All he cared about was the consequence. Before I could decide whether to respond, another message followed. If you do not fix this, you will regret it. The words were meant to intimidate, but all they did was prove what I already knew. His concern was not for me. It was for himself. I took a screenshot of the conversation and saved it with the rest of my documentation. A few minutes later, my phone buzzed again, this time with a video message from Aunt Ruth. She had sent me the full ring recording. I opened it with a mixture of dread and relief. The footage was grainy, the angle limited, but the truth was unmistakable. It showed Lucas stepping toward me abruptly, his posture assertive, my body instinctively leaning back. It showed the moment his hand moved toward my ear. And even without sound, it showed the downward motion of the hearing aid falling. I watched the clip twice, then a third time. Not because I needed proof, but because it felt like reclaiming reality after years of having my experiences questioned. A few minutes later, she sent a text. I heard your mother on the phone earlier. They are trying to change the story so they do not have to face it. Do not let them pull you back into that. I typed back. Thank you. I would be lost without you. Her reply arrived instantly. You do not need me to tell you what is true. You already know. As the afternoon sun moved across my apartment, the gaslighting attempts continued. One relative after another reached out, each repeating a slightly different version of the same narrative. Lucas did not mean it. You misunderstood. He barely touched you. The camera angle is misleading. You overreacted because of your injury. Each message blurred into the next, and each one made the truth clearer. The more they tried to distort what happened, the more obvious it became that the story they wanted me to accept was collapsing under the weight of facts they could no longer control. By early evening, I put my phone on silent and placed it face down on the table. I felt tired, but not defeated. Their voices no longer dictated my reality. The truth was recorded in my documentation. It lived in the ring footage. It lived in my own memory. And most importantly, it lived in the quiet conviction rising within me. They were losing control of the narrative they had used to shape my place in the family my entire life. And for the first time, I was no longer afraid of the collapse. I was relieved. The next morning, I woke before my alarm, not because I was rested, but because something in me felt startlingly clear, as if the emotional fog from the last 2 days had finally thinned just enough for me to see the path forward. My phone lay on the nightstand, still on silent from the night before, but even without looking at the screen, I knew more messages were waiting. I could almost hear my mother's frantic explanations, my father's clipped disappointment, and Lucas's demands disguised as threats. But instead of dread rising in my chest, something steadier emerged, something I had not felt in years when it came to my family. Resolve. After brushing my teeth and making a simple breakfast, I opened my laptop and sat at the kitchen table where the morning light fell in soft stripes. The broken hearing aid still rested on the counter, its shape familiar enough to keep me grounded but no longer painful to look at. Documentation had given me clarity. Now I needed boundaries to give me peace. I opened a new email draft and typed the subject line slowly, deliberately, letting each word settle. Boundary notice for the next 30 days. I stared at the blinking cursor for a long moment before beginning. I knew that whatever I wrote would become a turning point in the story of our family, whether they acknowledged it or not. I began with the truth written as plainly as possible. I need time and space. For the next 30 days, I am establishing a no-contact period with the exception of emergencies involving life or health. I wrote that I was not doing this to punish anyone but to protect myself from the ongoing denial, blame shifting, and gaslighting that had escalated since Thanksgiving. I explained that this period was necessary for my emotional health and that I expected the boundary to be respected fully. I listed the conditions in calm, measured language. First, Lucas needed to acknowledge in writing that taking and breaking my hearing aid was not a joke and not an accident. Second, my parents needed to recognize that their reaction not only minimized the damage, but harmed our relationship in a way that could no longer be ignored. Third, any future communication after the 30 days would need to be respectful and grounded in truth, not rewritten narratives. I reread what I had written and was surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. This was not anger or revenge. It was clarity, the quiet kind that comes after a long storm. I did not ask for apologies. I did not ask for emotional promises. I asked only for truth. That alone felt revolutionary. Before hitting send, I called Aunt Ruth. She answered on the second ring, her voice warm and steady. "Morning, sweetheart." I told her what I planned to do. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "I think this is the healthiest thing you have ever done. You are drawing a line they cannot twist. Just make sure the line is for you and not for their reaction." Her approval steadied me even further. After hanging up, I returned to the laptop, took a deep breath, and clicked send. The message left my outbox with a quiet whoosh that felt far louder in my chest. Not 2 minutes passed before my phone lit up. First my mother, then my father, then Lucas. I ignored all of them. Instead, I made myself tea and sat on the couch, watching the steam drift upward. The first message arrived by email instead of text. It was from my mother, sent less than 3 minutes after she received my boundary letter. "Emily, we do not understand why you are being so dramatic about this. Families argue, siblings clash, but stepping away for 30 days is extreme. You are taking this too far." I read every sentence without reacting. It was predictable. The tone, the dismissal, the insistence that my boundaries were overreactions. I did not respond. A few minutes later, my father replied, "Emily, this is not how adults handle disagreements. You should talk things out, not run away." I had to close my eyes for a moment at the irony. Run away? As if spending years shrinking, compromising, and accepting blame had been anything but holding the family together. I did not respond. Then Lucas's message arrived. It was short and filled with the entitlement that had always shielded him. "I am not writing anything. I did nothing wrong. You are being insane. Fix this or stop acting like you are the victim." I stared at his words and felt nothing but a cool, steady detachment. For the first time, I could see the difference between anger meant to intimidate and anger that revealed fear. Lucas was scared, not of me, but of consequence. The boundary was working already. I put my phone on silent again and went about my day. I cleaned my apartment. I organized my EMT bag. I cooked a simple meal. Every small act felt like reclaiming space inside myself. Around late afternoon, my mother called again. I let it ring, then a text arrived seconds later. "We will not negotiate with our children. We raised you. You do not get to set terms." Something inside me cracked, but not in the old painful way. This time it cracked open into something freeing. I typed a simple reply. "I am not negotiating. I am protecting myself." Then I placed my phone on the table and walked away. Evening settled slowly over the city, and for the first time in my adult life, I did not feel the urge to check my messages every few minutes. I made dinner without interruptions. I listened to music. I let the quiet fill the room without tension. It was only later while washing dishes that I realized something else had changed. For the first time in years, I felt like my life was happening in my own hands, rather than slipping through someone else's expectations. The boundary letter was not a weapon, it was a line, and I stood on the side of it that finally felt like home. The first week of the 30-day boundary passed with a strange mixture of silence and noise, as if two versions of my family existed at once, one loudly unraveling behind closed doors and the other fading out of my daily life with every day I refused to respond. By day 7, the group texts had stopped, but the individual messages kept coming, each one more frantic, more defensive, more revealing of the cracks they could no longer hide. It was early morning when the escalation hit its peak. I was halfway through folding laundry when my phone vibrated with a message from my cousin Leah, the same cousin who had quietly sent me the screenshot of Lucas's suspension the week before. She texted, "Are you up? Aunt Carol is losing it." I frowned, my stomach tightening with that familiar childhood instinct of preparing for the next wave. Before I could type a reply, she sent another message. "Your mom is calling everyone in the family trying to control the story. She keeps saying you are punishing them on purpose." My chest rose and fell slowly as I absorbed the words. Of course, the narrative always needed to be managed even when it was collapsing under its own weight. I typed back a simple, "Thanks for letting me know," and put the phone aside. But the uneasy hum under my skin lingered. By noon, it became clear why. Another message arrived from Leah, this one longer, almost breathless in tone. "Lucas got pulled into HR again. Someone anonymously sent the department the video your aunt had. They know he lied. They are making him do anger management or he is out." I sat down at the edge of my couch, letting the information settle piece by piece. The video. The truth. Not from me, but from someone in the family who finally decided their integrity mattered more than their silence. My hands shook slightly, not from fear, but from the gravity of what this meant. For years, my parents had protected Lucas from consequences, smoothing over his temper, blaming me when necessary, rewriting every incident to keep him untarnished. But systems outside the family had no loyalty to the myth. They had policies, standards, and documentation has no favorite child. I took a slow breath as another message from Leah appeared. "Your mom is blaming you for everything. She says if you had just taken the joke and moved on, none of this would be happening." There it was again. The word joke stretched and twisted until it was supposed to excuse everything. I replied only with, "I am not responding to any of them right now," and put my phone back on the table. But the quiet did not last long. Hours later, my phone rang again. When I saw my father's name, I almost ignored it, but something in me wanted to hear the shape of the collapse in his voice. I answered without speaking. He filled the silence immediately. "Emily, your brother is being forced into an anger management class because of all this." His voice carried a brittle edge, like someone grasping at dignity while watching it slip through their fingers. I waited for the part where he would acknowledge Lucas's behavior, or his own, or my mother's. But that moment never came. Instead, he continued, "This is humiliating for him. You have pushed this too far." I answered calmly, evenly, as though I were responding to a difficult patient. "I did not push anything. Natural consequences are not punishment. They are the result of choices." He scoffed. "You always have to make things complicated. None of this would have happened if you handled it privately instead of letting outsiders get involved." I closed my eyes, letting the sheer absurdity wash over me. "Dad," I said quietly. I documented what happened. The insurance company asked for verification. The police followed procedure, and someone in the family sent the video to his employer. Not me. He hesitated. I could hear him wrestling with the reality that my calmness left no room for their narrative to cling to. Then he said something that stunned me in its cruelty. If you were stronger, he would not have joked like that, as if my injury was a character flaw, as if the broken hearing aid was my fault for not being resilient enough. I let his words hit me and fall away without absorbing them. "I am hanging up now," I said softly. "This conversation is not healthy for me." I ended the call before he could respond. My hands were steady, my breathing slow. For the first time ever, their cruelty did not shake my sense of self. It revealed theirs. Hours passed quietly until evening cast a soft blue through my apartment. I was heating leftover soup when my phone lit up with a call from Aunt Ruth. Unlike every other call that week, I answered immediately. Her voice came through warm but heavy. "I talked to your mother today. She is scared not for Lucas, but for the image she spent decades building. She said the words reputation and embarrassment at least a dozen times." I felt a complicated mixture of sadness and relief wash through me. Sadness for the child who had once begged for validation. Relief for the adult who no longer needed it. Aunt Ruth continued, "They are falling apart because they cannot control the story anymore. But you did nothing wrong. Remember that." I thanked her, my voice quiet but certain. Later that night, I checked my email and found one final message from Lucas. It was short, angry, and almost desperate. "You think you are better than us. You are nothing without this family. Fix this." I stared at the words for a long moment, then closed the email without responding. Because for the first time in my life, I realized something with absolute clarity. I had not broken the family. I had stopped allowing them to break me, and that was the moment everything truly collapsed for them. Not when the police called, not when the company suspended Lucas, not when the video surfaced, but when I stopped participating in the story that kept them comfortable. The break point had arrived, and I was finally on the other side of it. The week after the family breakpoint unfolded with a strange gentleness I had not felt in a long time, as if my life had finally slowed enough for me to hear myself think. The silence from my parents and Lucas continued, but instead of feeling abandoned or anxious, I felt an unfamiliar sense of spaciousness, a kind of emotional breathing room that let my shoulders relax in ways I had forgotten were possible. Rebuilding myself did not begin with a dramatic moment or a sudden revelation. It began with small choices, almost ordinary ones, the sort of choices you miss entirely when your life is filled with chaos and noise. The first came the day I walked into the audiology clinic for my scheduled evaluation. The receptionist greeted me by name, her tone warm and unhurried, and for the first time in weeks, I did not feel the need to explain myself or brace for skepticism. When the audiologist examined the fragments of my old hearing aid, she frowned sympathetically and said, "This kind of damage is not typical wear and tear, but the good news is we can help you through the EMT assistance program." I felt something loosen in my chest at those words. Help without blame, support without conditions, a sense of being cared for not because I had proven myself worthy, but because I was human and deserving of it. They fitted me with a temporary device first sleek and comfortable, and when the soft click of activation filled my left ear, the world shifted slightly subtly like a curtain lifting. I could hear the hum of the overhead lights, the rustle of paper at the front desk, the faint buzz of an electric heater in the hall. Sounds I had forgotten were missing. I blinked hard, swallowing the lump in my throat. The audiologist touched my shoulder gently and said, "Take your time. Healing is not just physical." On the drive home, I rolled down the window a little, despite the cold, listening to the winter air whistle faintly along the edge of the door. It was the first drive in a long time where the silence in the car felt peaceful rather than lonely. At home, I sat on the balcony with a blanket around my shoulders, watching the late afternoon sun melt into pale gold over the rooftops. I let the sounds of the neighborhood wash over me, dogs barking a distant siren, someone scraping ice off their windshield. Each sound was a reminder that the world was bigger than the four walls of my parents' expectations. The next step in rebuilding myself came from work. My team lead pulled me aside during shift change and said some of the crew are hosting a late Friendsgiving Friday night. "You should come." When I hesitated, she added with a small smile, "You deserve a table where people are glad you are there." The invitation sank into me like warmth spreading through cold fingers. I had spent so long shrinking around my family that I had forgotten what it felt like to be wanted, not tolerated. Friday evening arrived and I almost talked myself out of going, but something inside whispered that healing required movement, not isolation. The apartment I walked into was bright and full of life. Someone had set up string lights across the ceiling and the table overflowed with mismatched dishes and store-bought pies. When I stepped through the door, everyone stopped what they were doing long enough to turn toward me with genuine smiles. "There you are. We saved you a seat. A seat saved for me. Not out of obligation, not to keep up appearances, but because they wanted me there." That small moment cracked something open inside my chest. During dinner, they asked about my work, my favorite calls, the moments that made the job meaningful. Not once did anyone ask about my family. Not once did anyone suggest I minimize what happened. They just let me be. Later, while washing dishes with a coworker named Maya, she said, "You always look so calm on scene. Like nothing rattles you." I laughed softly. Things rattle me. I just learned to keep going anyway. She handed me a towel and said, "Maybe you should be that calm with yourself too." Her words stayed with me long after I went home. Over the next few days, I took small steps toward rebuilding myself. I scheduled a therapy appointment, something I had put off for months. I started journaling at night, writing not just about the pain, but about the clarity emerging from it. I bought myself fresh groceries instead of skipping meals. I cleaned my apartment not out of anxiety, but out of care. Every small act felt like reclaiming a piece of myself that had been buried under years of being told I was too sensitive, too emotional, too dramatic. One morning, I woke to the sound of birds outside my window, their chirping faint but unmistakable through the new hearing aid. Tears filled my eyes unexpectedly. Something so simple, so ordinary, yet it felt like a rebirth. I sat on the edge of my bed in the early light, letting the sound fill me. This was what healing could look like. Not dramatic transformations, not sudden closure, but tiny openings in the world that reminded me I was still here, still capable of hearing beauty, still able to build a life not defined by pain. The 30-day boundary was still in effect, and my parents had not honored it even once. But strangely, it no longer felt like a threat. It felt like a shield. The distance gave me perspective. Their panic, their denial, their anger were no longer my responsibility to manage. Their discomfort was not a crisis I needed to solve. For the first time, I saw them clearly, not through the lens of a child desperate for approval, but through the eyes of a woman who had survived harm and chosen herself. One night, as I lay in bed, the city lights glowing through my blinds, I realized something simple but profound. Healing was not only about feeling better, it was about feeling whole, feeling entitled to peace, feeling worthy of rest, safety, and kindness. I closed my eyes and let the quiet surround me. For the first time, it felt like the quiet belonged to me. The audacity return did not arrive with a phone call or a text message. It arrived in the most predictable, quietly intrusive way possible. A knock on my apartment door just after 7 on a cold Friday evening. I had just come back from a late shift, still in my EMT jacket, hair damp from the snow outside, when the knock echoed again, gentle but insistent. I froze for a moment because no one ever came to my door unannounced. My friends always texted first, my neighbors never bothered me, and deliveries were dropped at the ground floor mailroom. Only one category of people would show up without warning: family. My stomach tightened as I moved closer to the door. Through the peephole, I saw my mother standing there, bundled in her expensive wool coat, clutching her purse to her chest, as if she were the one who had been wronged. She looked smaller than usual, or maybe it was just the first time I had seen her without the comfortable backdrop of the family home. I opened the door halfway, keeping the chain locked, not out of hostility, but out of self-preservation. Mom blinked at me, clearly surprised I had not flung the door open like I always used to. "Hi, Emily," she said, her voice soft and rehearsed, as if she had practiced a version of herself she hoped would disarm me. "Can we talk?" I hesitated, then slid the chain free and opened the door just wide enough for her to step inside. She entered the apartment like someone entering a museum exhibit, looking around at the small living room, the thrifted shelf, the second-hand couch, the plants I kept by the window. "This is nice," she said, though her tone suggested confusion more than admiration. I nodded and gestured vaguely toward the kitchen table. She sat down carefully, smoothing her coat over her lap. The silence stretched between us until she finally cleared her throat. "Emily, we owe you an apology." I stood at the counter, arms crossed loosely, and waited. Mom's hands twisted together as she spoke. "We are sorry you felt hurt at Thanksgiving. Sorry if things got a little out of hand." I closed my eyes briefly. There it was, the non-apology, the kind of apology that placed the blame on my reaction rather than their actions. I opened my eyes and said calmly, "That is not an apology." Mom stiffened. "Of course it is. We are acknowledging that you were upset." "No." I moved to the chair across from her and sat down, folding my hands on the table. "An apology is when you acknowledge what you did and why it was wrong. You are apologizing for my feelings, not your behavior." She blinked rapidly, as if no one had ever spoken to her in such plain terms. "Emily, this has all been very stressful for your father and me. Lucas is struggling. The family is upset." I waited. She continued, "Your father thinks maybe you overreacted." Lucas was only joking. There it was again. The erasure of harm wrapped in soft words. I breathed in slowly. "Mom, the hearing aid was medical equipment." He grabbed me. He ripped it out of my ear. "He smashed something I need to function. That is not a joke." Her lips pressed together, and for the first time she looked genuinely uncomfortable. "But families say things. Brothers roughhouse. You have always been sensitive." I held her gaze. "I am not sensitive. I set boundaries. And the fact that setting boundaries reads as sensitivity to you says more about how you raised us than it does about me." She looked away, eyes drifting to a framed photograph on my side table of my EMT team smiling in their uniforms. She seemed startled, maybe even unsettled by how different my life looked when she was not at the center of it. Mom took a deep breath and tried again. "Your father and I want you to come home for dinner on Sunday. We can work this out." I shook my head immediately. "The 30-day boundary still stands. You violated it by coming here." I did not yell. I did not tremble. I simply stated it like a fact, the same way I would note a patient's vital signs. She looked offended. "We are your parents. Boundaries do not apply the same way." My voice came out quieter than I expected, but steadier than I felt. "Boundaries apply especially to the people who violate them the most." Her jaw clenched, and she seemed to gather herself as if preparing for a final attempt. "Lucas misses you. He wants forgiveness." She reached into her purse and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. "He wrote you something." I did not reach for it. "Does it take accountability?" I asked. She hesitated. "He said he is sorry things escalated, and he is sorry you misread his intentions." I let out a slow breath. "Then it is not an apology." Mom's frustration finally surfaced. "Emily, for heaven's sake. He is trying. Family needs forgiveness. You cannot cut people out just because they make mistakes." I met her eyes, feeling a calm settle over me that I had not felt since the night of the incident. "I am not cutting anyone out. I am protecting myself." "There is a difference." Her expression flickered with something like disbelief, or fear, or maybe recognition. A recognition that the old version of me, the daughter who swallowed her pride to keep the peace, no longer existed. Mom stood abruptly, her coat rustling. "I do not know what has gotten into you." I rose as well. "Self-respect. That is what has gotten into me." She stared at me for a long time, as if seeing me for the first time in years. When she finally spoke, her voice was small. "Emily, we want to fix this. Tell us what to do." I softened just a fraction. "Tell the truth. Acknowledge what Lucas did. Stop minimizing. Stop pretending it was a joke, and do not come back until you are ready to do that." She swallowed hard, nodded once, and walked to the door. Before she stepped outside, she turned back with an expression I could not read. "My door is not closed," I added gently. "It just needs honesty to open." She left without another word. When the door clicked shut behind her, I leaned back against it and exhaled slowly, feeling my heartbeat settle. For the first time ever, my mother had come to me seeking absolution and left without it. For the first time ever, I had held the line, and for the first time ever, the silence that followed did not feel empty. It felt like strength. The realistic consequences did not arrive like a dramatic explosion, but rather like a slow unraveling. Each thread tugged loose by truth accountability and the natural fallout of actions that had been minimized for too long. About 2 weeks after my mother's unexpected visit, I received a short email from the HR department of the home security company where Lucas worked. It was a courtesy notice stating that they had attempted to reach me by phone, but wanted to confirm that the police had contacted Lucas for verification regarding damaged medical equipment. They were not asking me to press charges. They were simply fulfilling their corporate obligation to investigate potential employee misconduct when law enforcement involvement was noted. It was clinical, factual, and completely free of emotion, which somehow made it hit harder. In any other family, Lucas would have reached out to me himself to explain or apologize, but the silence from him only confirmed what I already knew. He had not taken responsibility. He had not learned anything. He had merely been forced into the consequences he had always been shielded from. A few days later, Aunt Ruth called me from her living room, the television murmuring softly in the background. She lowered her voice as if the walls themselves were listening. "You should know that your parents are not taking this well," she said. "They told the extended family that you exaggerated, but people saw the ring footage and word is spreading. People are not buying their story anymore." I let out a breath I had not realized I was holding. The version of my parents who lived inside their social circle was finally cracking the carefully curated image of the calm, respectable Midwestern family, giving way to the truth they had buried for decades. The fallout began at church first. An elderly woman who had known us since childhood quietly pulled her hand back when my mother tried to greet her. Another family, longtime friends, stopped inviting them to group dinners. A cousin confronted them at a birthday party, asking outright, "Why would you let him hurt her?" My parents responded with their usual refrains. "Emily is sensitive," or "Lucas was joking," but those excuses had lost their power now that the truth existed in video form. Even people who loved them could not pretend anymore. Meanwhile, Lucas faced his own reckoning. HR placed him on mandatory administrative leave while they completed their internal review. When he tried to explain away the police contact as a misunderstanding, his supervisor asked for a written statement. His statement was vague and defensive, and when the company compared it to the factual information in the verification report, the discrepancies stood out plainly. They required him to complete anger management classes before he could return to work. He refused at first, arguing that it was unnecessary and humiliating, but with bills to pay and a job on the line, he eventually agreed. Aunt Ruth told me that he complained loudly about it at family gatherings, calling me dramatic, calling the company unfair, calling the entire situation revenge. But the mandatory classes cost money. The suspension cost him income. The possibility of losing his job cost him sleep. And every morning he woke up to consequences that were not born from spite, but from reality finally catching up to him. My parents tried to comfort him in their usual ways, minimizing, excusing, blaming circumstances or stress, or the world being too sensitive these days. But over time, even they could not deny what was happening. Neighbors asked uncomfortable questions. A coworker of my father pulled him aside at lunch and said I saw the footage. That was not a joke. The shame my parents had tried so desperately to avoid had found them anyway, not because of me, but because of the truth they had spent years refusing to acknowledge. Through all of this, I remained silent, not vindictive, not triumphant, just removed. My number stayed blocked on their phones. I did not check in. I did not respond to distant relatives sending messages asking for my side. I simply let the distance do the work. People often think the greatest punishment is anger, but in toxic families, the greatest punishment is absence. The silence they once forced onto me had finally turned around and settled on them, and they felt it. Aunt Ruth mentioned in passing that my mother had begun crying at night. My father had grown quiet, withdrawn, snapping at small things. Lucas had lost weight. But even then, none of them reached the point of genuine accountability. Not yet. The consequences continued unfolding in subtle but real ways. Lucas missed his chance for the team lead probation he had bragged about at Thanksgiving. Another coworker took the spot while he was suspended. His supervisor noted his attitude as a problem during the review process. He was placed on a 6-month behavioral watch program which made future promotions extremely unlikely. My mother found herself isolated at holiday planning meetings. My father skipped the neighborhood Christmas party out of embarrassment. Someone anonymously sent them a link to an article about gaslighting, which my mother printed and left on the counter as if it were meant for someone else. Meanwhile, my life slowly brightened in the quiet way that healing does. I showed up to work more grounded. I slept easier. The new hearing aid brought everyday sounds back into my world. I felt myself stepping into a version of adulthood that was stronger and clearer than anything I had known before. I was not winning anything. I was not taking anything. I was simply living. And that, ironically, was the consequence they felt most deeply. In March, I learned from Aunt Ruth that my parents had finally admitted to her privately that they had mishandled the situation. Not fully. Not honestly. They couched it in excuses and justifications and regrets for how things had escalated rather than what they had allowed. But it was the first crack. For the first time, my mother said out loud, "Maybe we should have stopped him. Maybe we should not have called it a joke." And for the first time, my father did not interrupt her to defend Lucas. That was their consequence. Not ruin, not punishment, not vengeance, but the recognition that their silence had cost them their daughter for half a year and counting. They had finally begun to feel the distance they once demanded I tolerate. They had finally stepped into the quiet they once forced on me. And the quiet, I suspected, was louder for them than it had ever been for me. The quiet peace arrived slowly, almost shyly, like something that did not want to be noticed too soon in case it disappeared. It came in small gestures and soft mornings in the steady rhythm of a life finally free from the noise that had drowned me for years. 1 year after the Thanksgiving incident, I found myself preparing for my own version of the holiday, a modest Friendsgiving in my tiny Columbus apartment, nothing fancy, nothing curated for photos, just warmth and truth and people who meant what they said. The afternoon sun poured through the windows, casting long, gentle stripes across the kitchen floor as I stirred a pot of soup, the scent of rosemary filling the room. There was no rush, no pressure. No voice in my head reminding me to perform or impress or earn my place. For the first time in my adult life, I had chosen who sat at my table. I paused to adjust the hearing aid behind my left ear, the newer model provided through the EMT injury support program, sleek and steady and almost invisible. When it clicked into place, I heard the simmering broth more clearly, the soft clinking of the wooden spoon against the pot, the faint whirring of the heater in the hallway. Ordinary sounds, yet they felt like a gift every time. A quiet knock came at the door. When I opened it, my coworker Maya stood there wrapped in a knit scarf, holding a pie box and smiling in a way that softened even the cold November air around her. "I hope I did not burn it," she said, handing the box to me. I grinned. "You say that every year." She stepped inside, stomping the snow off her boots, glancing around the room with the familiarity of someone who knew she belonged. Soon, others joined my EMT partners, 2 neighbors from my building, a cousin on my father's side who had quietly supported me through messages long before my parents admitted anything. Every arrival brought laughter and warmth, the kind that fills the corners of a room and makes it feel larger than it is. As people settled in, I found myself standing by the window for a moment, looking out at the dusky sky as the first flakes of snow drifted down in lazy spirals. A year ago, I had stood in the same spot, feeling hollow raw and unsure if my family's absence meant I had failed them or they had failed me. Now the quiet settling in my chest felt entirely different. Not emptiness, not loss, just peace. True peace. The kind that arrives when you stop chasing people who keep walking away. Dinner was simple and imperfect in the best possible way. My thrifted bowls did not match. The table wobbled slightly. Someone spilled gravy, someone else oversalted the potatoes, and yet the room glowed with a sort of unpolished joy. We ate, we talked, we shared stories from the year, the emergencies we handled, the moments we laughed through exhaustion, the shifts that nearly broke us, and the ones that reminded us why we chose this life. At one point, the group grew louder, and I instinctively adjusted my hearing aid, not out of frustration, but gratitude, because I could hear them. I could hear every laugh, every off-key hum to the background music, every soft thank you passed across the table. I could hear the life I had built for myself. After dessert, when people were still chatting, there was a soft envelope placed near my coat by the entryway. No one claimed to have left it. No one said a word. When I finally picked it up, I recognized my mother's handwriting instantly, the careful loops, the slightly slanted lines. I stood still for a long moment before opening it. Inside was a single sheet of paper folded twice. The first line startled me in its plain honesty. "Emily, we were wrong." I kept reading. She wrote about the year that had passed, about the silence in the house since I stepped away, about how the walls were quieter, not because I had left, but because they finally heard themselves. She wrote that the ring footage changed everything for them, not just the incident, but the undeniable proof of a pattern they had dismissed for decades. She wrote that she and my father had begun therapy 3 months earlier. She admitted that they had called it a joke because jokes were easier to explain than cruelty. She admitted that Lucas had been protected for far too long. She admitted that she had failed me, not in a performative way, not coded in excuses, just truth bare and finally spoken. At the end, she wrote, "I want to make things right, but only in the way you feel safe. I love you. I miss you. I will wait." There was no pressure, no bargaining, no guilt. Just a door quietly placed on the table between us for me to open if and when I chose. I folded the letter carefully and slipped it into my coat pocket, not ready to respond yet, but not rejecting it either. Healing was not a straight line. Some wounds took time. Some trust had to be rebuilt from the foundation up. Some relationships had to learn what honesty felt like before they could return. Later that night, after the guests had left and the apartment had grown still again, I stood at the sink washing dishes. The running water, the clink of plates, the soft hum of the refrigerator all blended into a gentle soundtrack. When I turned off the faucet, I stepped back, drying my hands, and let myself take in the room. The string lights along the wall glowed warmly. The chairs were slightly crooked. A half-eaten pie sat on the counter. Everything was imperfect and simple, and exactly enough. I thought about the family I had been born into and the family I had found. I thought about the girl I used to be, the one who laughed off insults, who excused harm, who tried to earn love by shrinking herself. And then I thought about the woman standing here now, steady, clear, and whole. A soft peace settled into me, the kind that was earned, not inherited, the kind built from boundaries rather than fear, the kind shaped by choosing myself when my family refused to. I walked to the window, watching the snow continue to fall, each flake drifting silently toward the ground. My hearing aid picked up the faint sound of wind against the building, a whisper of winter. For a brief moment, I closed my eyes and let the quiet fill me. It felt like the first breath after coming up from deep water, the kind of breath that tastes like survival, the kind of breath that tastes like freedom. When I opened my eyes, I whispered to the room, to my past, to anyone who needed to hear it. Family is not who shares your blood. Family is who protects your dignity. A year ago, I walked away from a table where love had conditions. Tonight, I sat at a table where love had none, and that I realized was the quiet peace I had been searching for my entire life. If this story found its way into a quiet corner of your evening or stirred something familiar in your heart, I want to invite you to pause with me for just a moment and think about what it means to protect your dignity in a world that often asks you to shrink to keep the peace. So many of us grew up in families where silence was expected, where keeping harmony meant burying hurt, and where love came with conditions hidden beneath jokes or brushed off as misunderstandings. But you and I both know that the older we get, the clearer the truth becomes. Peace that demands your silence is not peace. Love that requires you to overlook cruelty is not love. And boundaries are not acts of rebellion. They are acts of survival. If any part of Emily's story reminded you of your own life, your own kitchen table, your own childhood living room, know this: you are not alone. And you do not have to keep carrying the weight of other people's comfort on your shoulders. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is step back. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for yourself is say no more. And sometimes the greatest healing begins the moment you stop asking others to see your worth and start living in it yourself. If this story resonated with you, I would love to hear from you. Share in the comments where you are watching from. Tell me the temperature outside your window tonight. Tell me if a moment in this story reminded you of a time you chose yourself even when it cost you something. Your experiences matter. Your voice matters. And someone else reading your comment might be carrying a burden they have never spoken out loud. Your story might be the reminder they needed that they are not alone. And if you want more stories like this, stories about dignity and boundaries and the quiet kind of justice that comes not from revenge, but from choosing peace, I hope you will subscribe to the channel. We build this little community one story at a time, and every time you watch, comment, or share, you help someone else feel a little less isolated and a little more understood. Maybe that someone is halfway across the country. Maybe they live 2 blocks away. Maybe it is even you. Thank you for spending these minutes with me today. Thank you for listening with an open heart. And thank you for choosing stories that honor truth, courage, and the kind of healing that does not always make noise but always makes a difference. Wherever you are and whatever you are carrying tonight, I hope you remember that your dignity is worth protecting, your boundaries are worth keeping, and your peace is worth fighting for. Come back for the next story. Until then, take care of yourself.